João Silva, a renowned lawyer, always enjoyed having lunch at the same elegant restaurant downtown. His impeccable attire and confident demeanor reflected his successful career. On that sunny Friday, João entered the restaurant, greeted the hostess with a smile, and made his way to his usual table. As he waited for his meal, a group of police officers entered the restaurant. They seemed to be looking for someone. João didn't pay much attention until one of the officers approached his table. "Excuse me, sir. I need you to identify yourself," the officer said harshly. Confused, João handed over his ID. The officer looked at the document and, without further explanation, asked João to stand up. "You're being detained for questioning. We received a report about a suspect matching your description," the officer stated. João tried to argue but was cut off when the officer handcuffed him in front of all the restaurant patrons. People around him watched with curiosity and disdain, murmuring prejudiced comments. Indignant and humiliated, João was taken to the police car under the incredulous and accusatory gazes of the crowd. At the police station, João was thrown into a small, dirty cell. He tried to stay calm, but the injustice of the situation was overwhelming. After a few hours, the chief entered the cell and looked at João with contempt. "We're going to ask you some questions, and if everything checks out, you'll be free to go," the chief said. João calmly answered all the questions, explaining that he was a respected lawyer and had no involvement in any illegal activities. Even so, the chief seemed reluctant to release him. Meanwhile, at João's office, his assistant, Maria, began to worry about his prolonged absence. She called some colleagues and, upon discovering that João had been detained, decided to take action. Maria contacted a journalist friend, Pedro, and together they began to investigate what had happened. Pedro managed to access the restaurant's security cameras and discovered that the report had been made by a racist customer who didn't like seeing a black man in such a sophisticated place. With this information, Maria and Pedro went to the police station. When they arrived, they demanded to speak with the chief. After a lengthy discussion and under the pressure of a potential media scandal, the chief finally decided to release João. As he walked out of the cell, João was exhausted but grateful to Maria and Pedro. However, he knew this story was far from over. He decided he wouldn't let it go and planned to use all his influence and knowledge to seek justice. João called a press conference to tell his story. He recounted the humiliation he suffered and how he was unjustly detained because of his skin color. The story gained enormous traction, sparking heated debates about racism and abuse of power. Meanwhile, João began investigating the chief who arrested him. He discovered that this wasn't an isolated incident. The chief had a history of abusive and prejudiced behavior. Determined to act, João started gathering evidence and witnesses of other similar cases. During his investigations, João stumbled upon an unexpected lead about his own history. While delving into the chief's past, he found out that the chief was involved in an old missing person case that was never solved. João was intrigued and began to dig deeper. That's when he found something shocking: documents linking the chief to a significant figure from the past. This man, Ricardo Almeida, was a powerful businessman who had controlled much of the city for decades. João discovered that Ricardo Almeida had a son who mysteriously disappeared years ago. Comparing the dates and facts, João realized that he could be this missing son. The discovery shook him, but he knew he needed to confirm this theory before taking any action. João knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed concrete proof to verify his suspicions. With Maria and Pedro's help, he started searching for clues about his past. His childhood memories were vague, but he knew he was adopted at a young age by a loving family that rarely spoke about his biological parents. João decided to confront his adoptive parents. In an emotional conversation, he revealed what he had discovered and asked them to tell the truth. With tears in her eyes, his adoptive mother, Clara, confirmed that he was found in an orphanage at 3 years old and that the adoption was shrouded in mystery. She never knew who his biological parents were. Determined to uncover more, João asked a geneticist friend to help him conduct a DNA test. He obtained a sample from Ricardo Almeida, who was hospitalized due to his advanced age. After a few days of anxious waiting, the results came back. João was indeed Ricardo Almeida's missing son. The revelation about his true identity brought a whirlwind of emotions to João. He decided to meet Ricardo Almeida to confront him and understand why he was abandoned. With Maria's help, he managed to schedule a visit to the hospital. At the hospital, João entered Ricardo's room and found a frail man with eyes still full of determination. Ricardo, upon seeing João, seemed to recognize something familiar in his face. "Who are you?" Ricardo asked in a hoarse voice. "I'm João Silva, and I believe I'm your son," João replied, showing the DNA test results. Ricardo was silent for a few moments before he began to tell his story. Years ago, he had been involved in illegal activities and made many enemies. To protect his son, he hid him and arranged for his adoption. However, he lost track of João over the years. Meanwhile, Pedro continued his investigations into the chief and his connections with Ricardo Almeida. He discovered that the chief was involved in a corruption network that Ricardo, at the height of his power, had controlled. With Ricardo's decline, the chief took over and continued the illegal operations. Pedro shared this information with João, who saw it as an opportunity to clear his biological father's name and seek justice. João decided he would expose the entire corruption network, starting with the chief. João arranged a secret meeting with the chief, pretending he wanted to negotiate a deal. However, he was recording the entire conversation. During the meeting, João managed to get the chief to confess to his crimes and his involvement in the corruption network. With the recordings in hand, João, Maria, and Pedro went to the press again. The story exploded, generating outrage and leading to an official investigation. The chief was arrested, and several others involved in the corruption network were identified. With the fall of the chief and the corruption network, João felt he had finally achieved justice. However, he still had personal matters to resolve. He reconnected with Ricardo Almeida, who was very ill, and began visiting him regularly at the hospital. During these visits, Ricardo shared stories from his past and asked for forgiveness for his mistakes. Ricardo passed away shortly after, but not before reconciling with João. He left his fortune to João, who decided to use part of the resources to help fight against racism and corruption. João also created a foundation in the name of his adoptive father, who had always supported and believed in him. João's story, from humiliation to triumph, became a symbol of resilience and justice. He continued his career as a lawyer, now with a new purpose: to fight for the oppressed and ensure that no one else would go through what he had experienced. After Ricardo Almeida's death and the exposure of the corruption network, João Silva became an even more respected and influential public figure. His foundation gained notoriety and began to attract the attention of donors and volunteers willing to fight for social causes. However, with his new position came new challenges and adversaries. Some of the chief's former allies, now exposed and threatened with imprisonment, started conspiring against Joao. They wanted revenge and were willing to use any means necessary to discredit him and destroy his reputation. Joao began receiving anonymous threats. Letters, emails, and disturbing phone calls became part of his routine. He reinforced his personal security, but the threats didn't stop. One morning, he found his car vandalized with messages of hate and intimidation. Maria and Pedro, always by his side, insisted that Joao report these threats to the police. Reluctantly but convinced by his friends, Joao filed a police report and started a process to uncover who was behind the threats. Meanwhile, Pedro continued his parallel investigations. He discovered that the individuals responsible for the threats were former members of the corruption network that the chief had led. These individuals, fearing imprisonment and the loss of their positions of power, were desperate to silence Joao. With this information, Joao and his team of lawyers began preparing a new case against the conspirators. They gathered evidence, testimonies, and devised a plan to expose the new conspiracy. Joao decided it was time to act. He organized a press conference to announce that he had evidence against the conspirators and would hand it over to the authorities. The strategy was to draw out the enemies and catch them red-handed. During the conference, Joao was surprised by an armed attack. One of the conspirators attempted to shoot him, but thanks to the reinforced security, the attack was quickly neutralized. The police arrested the shooter, and after interrogating him, they managed to identify the other conspirators. With the new arrests and confessions, Joao and his team finally dismantled what was left of the corruption network. The conspirators were tried and convicted, bringing a sense of justice and relief to Joao and his foundation. With his enemies finally defeated, Joao could focus his efforts on expanding his foundation. He created educational programs, offered scholarships to underprivileged youth, and organized awareness campaigns about racism and corruption. Joao also decided to get involved in politics, realizing that he could make an even greater difference by fighting for structural changes. With the support of Maria, Pedro, and his community, he ran for public office, promising to continue his fight for justice and equality. Joao was elected by an overwhelming majority. His platform of justice, transparency, and equality resonated with the population. In public office, he implemented policies that benefited marginalized communities and worked tirelessly to eradicate corruption. His work inspired many others to join the cause, creating a wave of positive change. Joao, now a national leader, never forgot his roots and the humiliation he endured, using that experience as motivation to keep fighting for a better world. Years passed, and Joao continued to make history. His foundation became one of the largest and most respected in the country. He received numerous awards and honors for his tireless work. But above all, Joao was proud to have turned pain and humiliation into a force for good. His story became a symbol of resilience and hope, showing that even in the face of the greatest adversities, it is possible to fight and win. With national recognition and the success of his policies, Joao began to gain attention on the international stage. Invitations to speak at conferences and forums around the world became common. During one of these trips, Joao was invited to participate in a global forum on human rights and social justice held in Geneva. At the forum, he met leaders and activists from various countries, all sharing experiences and solutions to similar problems. João was approached by an international organization that sought his help in resolving a complex case of corruption and abuse of power in an African country. João accepted the challenge and, with a team composed of Maria, Pedro, and other experts, traveled to the country in question. There, he found a chaotic situation, with the population living under oppression and fear. The local authorities were corrupt and did nothing to improve people's lives. João and his team began working with local community leaders and activists, gathering evidence and testimonies. They organized peaceful demonstrations and used the media to expose the injustices. Despite threats and dangers, João was determined to make a difference. During his stay, João met an unexpected figure, Aisha, a young local lawyer with a similar life story to his. Aisha had lost her family to the violence of the corrupt regime and dedicated her life to the fight for justice. Together, they formed a powerful and inspiring alliance. Aisha provided valuable insights and local connections that helped accelerate the evidence-gathering process. With her help, João managed to create a support network within the country, strengthening the movement for justice. The actions of João and his team did not go unnoticed by the corrupt regime. Tension escalated, and João found himself at the center of a dangerous conflict once again. The regime's leader, General Kalunga, decided that João was a threat that needed to be eliminated. On a stormy night, João and Aisha were ambushed by mercenaries hired by the general. There was a shootout, and João was severely injured. Aisha managed to get him to a safe place where they received emergency medical help. Even injured, João refused to give up. While recovering, he continued to coordinate his team's actions. The local community, inspired by João and Aisha's courage, united in a popular uprising. Pressured by the population and international attention, the local authorities had no choice but to arrest General Kalunga and his accomplices. With the fall of the regime, the country began a process of reconstruction. João and Aisha helped organize free and fair elections, bringing hope for a better future. The work was arduous, but gradually, peace and justice began to prevail. João returned to his country as an international hero. His courage and determination inspired not only his people but also people around the world. He received honors from various nations and continued to use his influence to promote justice and human rights globally. Back in his country, João dedicated himself to writing a book about his experiences, sharing lessons learned and strategies for confronting injustice. His book became a bestseller, inspiring a new generation of activists and leaders. João also founded a new international organization dedicated to combating corruption and promoting human rights in developing countries. He traveled tirelessly, giving lectures and supporting justice movements worldwide. Years later, older and with his life's mission fulfilled, João retired to a quieter life. He spent his days in a seaside house, surrounded by family and friends who had always stood by his side. Although retired, he remained a respected figure consulted on matters of justice and human rights. João Silva passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by loved ones. However, his legacy continued to live on through the countless lives he touched and the institutions he created. João became a legend, an eternal symbol of the fight against injustice and hope for a better future. His children and grandchildren continued his work, ensuring that the lessons and values he stood for were never forgotten. Thus, João Silva's story remained alive, inspiring future generations to fight for a more just and equal world.